Welcome to Proof of PR, your passport to the world of public relations for teams building on-chain. I'm your host, Kelley Weaver, CEO of Melrose PR, a leading provider of crypto communications and PR strategy, and founder of BITWIRE, the modern newswire reimagined for today's comms professionals. Get ready for an inside look into the future of finance, technology, and entrepreneurship from those driving innovation in our space. Join us as we learn how they generate headlines, cut through the noise, and grow their brand awareness through media placements, press mentions, and thought leadership. These are the stories behind their success. This is Proof of PR. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to welcome our guest today, Keli Callaghan, who's a partner at Arrington Capital. Welcome, Keli.
Thank you, Kelley W, for having me.
We have the Kelly squared going on, although we spell our names differently. You're Keli, I'm Kelley. So excited to dive in today, Keli. Wanted to hear a little bit from you about your background and how you landed here in this position and in crypto.
Of course. Yeah, happy to share. So my whole career has been marketing, comms, big brand strategies, community engagement strategies across a whole variety of industries. Very varied. Publishing, media and entertainment, railroad and transportation. So just always weird industries, but always on the technology side and always in charge of growing or creating a bigger community. Got into crypto a little bit by accident 7 or 8 years ago now. Silvio Macaulay was doing Algorand out of MIT, and they needed sort of a growth go-to-market person. And I joined them. It was, back then there was nothing on crypto, or it was very limited, right? And so I was handed a 72-page white paper on math and economics. Now, I just laid out that I don't have a background. I've got my MBA and all that, but I don't have background in economics, in traditional finance, in computer science. And so I was handed this 72-page white paper, and it's 72 pages of math and economics. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, crap. What did I get myself into? And there wasn't a lot of other places to go and learn from. There was no other basis for that knowledge. And so I had no other choice but to dive in on proof of work and zero knowledge proofs and cryptographic sortition. And so that was my foray into crypto, which was a blast, by the way. And was at Algorand.
That was a brave. I feel like you dove off the deep end on the diving board.
Well, back then, if you looked at it, I say back then, I mean, I guess being in crypto as long as some of us have, like we're technically 85, 90 years old at this point, but it was only 7 or 8 years ago. But not only was there not a lot of information there, but it was, if you were going to make a big career move, it was big data or AI or crypto. Like there were a handful of things, and Web3 was right on there. And so why not, right? And it was local and it was here. So it was great. And it was a really interesting opportunity. Algorand at the time was the only thing that didn't have like a direct connection somehow, either technically or through people, to the Ethereum community. And so if you look back at 2017, it really was like there were a couple other things going on, but one of the only things that didn't have that connection to the Bitcoin or the ETH community. And there were a lot of headwinds to face there, just from a general education and knowledge perspective, to how you built that community and how you had to compete with the other existing community, not compete, but sort of work in alignment with the other communities that were there. So it was, it was super fun, and it was definitely a learning experience. I don't think I'd change anything. Michael Arrington was on the cap table there, and out of all the investors, he was always like really super supportive, was there for a quick piece of advice. I need a favor. Can you get me an intro to this? And he was always there and being supportive. And so when I was trying to figure out sort of next chapter and what that looked like, he was like, come join the fund, new investments, portfolio support. And I get to do for our founders what Mike did for me. And I truly love that. So I do a lot of early stage support for our founders and go to market and PR and making announcements, helping to hire CMOs, heads of marketing when they're ready for that. And, sit on the new investment committee and what we're investing to and where we're deploying capital. So that's sort of my story in a nutshell.
I love that. So you've worked in marketing in sort of like go to market for so long. Since you started in crypto and like cut to today, how has it changed in terms of like how you're seeing this evolution of like what founders need to be thinking about today?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, you know, back then there was a lot of emphasis on the community and real decentralization, which I think there still is today, obviously. But you also see early projects today with founder-led marketing, and I think early on, like Silvio wasn't, he was definitely a thought leader. He was a touring award winner. He had proven himself. He wasn't necessarily on the speaking circuit or engaging with the community every single day, right? And I think that that's a little different. And he didn't need to be, because we sort of built a really strong community when the markets were in a lower spot, and those people held on and stuck with us. And I think now, like, it's really important for the founder voices, especially. Maybe I'm just more cautious of this because we are doing earlier stage investments where the founder is what it is, right? That founder is speaking about this new technology they've developed, or why this particular thing is needed in the market, or how this connects different things or makes the onboarding experience better. And so I think the founder led marketing is one thing that I'd flag as very different now versus back then. I think the news and media cycles have shifted, and I think that PR is very different back then versus now with Twitter and individual voices. And again, this plays into the founder led marketing. A founder who's got really amazing thoughts and is sharing those opinions on a very regular basis, that's way more interesting for most people to follow than an article that's sort of buried somewhere. And so I think there's a different balance of what PR is, who the reporters are that are very vocal on something like Twitter or X, and the founders that are really spewing like really interesting and exciting, innovative points.
That's such a good point. And even though I've been there for all of it, I hadn't really thought about how that it's been such a major shift. It's such a good point, because it's this decentralized technology where there's this kind of ethos of wanting things to be private and anonymous, but certainly in PR, we see that completely. And the founders who are the most vocal are the most successful.
And I think, like, Twitter has always been there. That's not a new thing. I think it's gotten more vocal, or there are more and more people. Like, it's grown, like the community's grown. And so you've got more figureheads that are talking and driving the conversation there, for sure. But it's always been there, and it still matters. Sentiment still matters. I think, here's something, I don't think that I personally put less weight on a follower count versus an actual engagement or sentiment metric. Like, I remember looking at this back in the day, we would compare ourselves to other projects and be like, well, we have better sentiment, and you can clearly tell, like, we've got less bots. But then that didn't matter. Like, everybody just needed this high bar of, we need this many things and this many metrics. And I think there's a lot to be said for the actual substance and the sentiment in a really like driven, dedicated community versus some of the bot farming that happens right now.
Piggybacking on this concept of like founder-led thought leadership, what are the different things that founders that you work with are doing well? Obviously, you mentioned like having a strong point of view on Twitter and sharing frequently. What are some other things that you see founders and encourage other founders to do?
It's a good question. I think one of the things that I find myself having this conversation when you have an early stage founder who it's like, okay, it's time. Like, you have a test net or a main net out. Like, it's time for you to start being out there more often. And I think the conversation I have most often is, you're going to get so sick of repeating yourself over and over and over. But you're always going to be sharing your story with new people, or in a new vertical, or at a new event, right? And you're going to get better at it, and you're going to hone it, and you always have to be able to like start up high and bubble it up and then drive it down. And so I think for founder-led marketing, I think it's just really important to know that, yes, many times you're going to feel like you're saying the same thing, but that's like the jam, right? Like, you're there and you're honing that story and you're adjusting it as the time goes on, or your product gets more mature. And that's just part of it. And it's also being able to be flexible and agile as you continue to be sort of spew out the gospel of what you're doing. I was at a smaller event a few weeks ago, and there were some funds. There were some people who were, I would call them crypto interested, but not necessarily crypto native audiences there. And then you had founders. And so you had these very deeply in the know crypto folks and you had people who weren't so deep in the know, and you had some founders that are on stage, and I think some of them were really good at bubbling up the narrative of what they were doing, and start at a high level and then walk people through it, versus you had some other founders that came right in and it was like, oh, don't lose your patience and go right to like page 110, right? Like just step it back for a minute and remind everybody, like not everybody else is doing what you're doing for 18 hours a day. Like you are, and that's amazing, and that's why you're successful right now. But you have to remind everyone who's only spending 5 minutes in your corner of the industry, like where you sit there. So I think, the founder-led marketing, I think is important. And I think it's just important to recognize that it's part of the job, and it's part of being a founder. And I think for many of the founders I see, I think they get sick of repeating them. I think they lose patience with repeating themselves.
Such a good point. The more you kind of deliver the pitch over and over, the more you refine it, as you mentioned. So it can be helpful. So you talked about a while ago the community building and community engagement was so important. It still definitely carries impact today. And I'm curious, like if you have any strategies for building community, or thoughts on how important that community is today for these projects.
I think it's obviously important. I think it's important to bring them along on the journey and have them have some skin in the game as that journey progresses, right? So it's not just a quick blip. We need you to share this, tweet this, show up to this, whatever. It's, and many of the early communities, like many of those early community members got very wealthy, right? And that's part of it, and sort of being there out of the gate, and how do you keep them involved? So I think, community building, I think there's a platform for. I think it's also important to be aware of how siloed crypto is and what we can all be doing to expand those communities. We named Colton has been at the fund for a little bit, and he was promoted to partner today. And so I did a podcast with him earlier this week, like your hot takes from Arrington's newest partner. And I was talking, he's a little bit younger than I am. And I was talking to him about, the university and school programs. He graduated from Yale a few years ago, and he like frequently shows up to some of the blockchain clubs at some of these schools and universities. And we were talking about how like the funding kind of lags some of the innovation. And if some of the funding is lagging, then, these schools and universities are lagging even further. And, I remember when some of the blockchain clubs were pretty big. I think many of them have shrunk in size, and that's the case that they're at right now. And so back to the point of community, like the university communities in Web3, I don't know if this is true, but to me, they seem to kind of be getting a little bit tighter and a little smaller. And so I think it's like, how do you tap into the up and coming generation of what the community looks like, and that's everybody. So I think community is important. I think we should all be thinking about how we educate people and build the community everywhere, right? It's a branding problem for the industry almost still.
Completely. And it's interesting you bring up the blockchain clubs at the universities. I've seen that sort of expand over the years, but then it does feel like we still have a ways to go. So it'll be interesting. Are the founders that you're working with recruiting a lot from universities? Like, is there a big effort there?
I think they're trying. I think a lot of the universities are still focused on AI being the shiny object right now. I think that happened when crypto went through its sort of downturn a few years ago, and we got stuck in a bunch of muck. And I don't think at the like university or new college entrant level, we've quite overcome that. I'm hoping that shifts and change, especially given sort of the pro regulation and crypto in America, and the fact that this country is a little bit more amenable to the industry. And, I can tell my parents what I do for a living and it's not shunned. Right. And so I think I think that will change, but I think that AI then took over a few years ago, and I don't think that's really shifted. And so I think people graduating today are still a little more focused on the AI stuff. And, I think a lot of that's fine, but I think there'll be fewer opportunities to be involved with like really interesting things versus Web3. You can go down we talk to people all the time in so many corners of so many different industries that are tokenizing this, that, or the other thing, or creating these new financial products, or redefining how things are traded or economic values shared. Like I think that's much more interesting than some of like the AI wrappers and some of the handful of large winners that will happen in AI.
Are you tired of wrestling with outdated newswire tools that waste your time and budget? Meet BITWIRE, your news amplified. Sharing your news should be the most celebrated moment in business. As communications professionals and founders, you deserve better than clunky interfaces and confusing pricing models. That's why we've reimagined the newswire for today's PR landscape. With BITWIRE, our AI-assisted tool turns 30 minutes of data entry into less than 5. Giving you back your most valuable resource, time. We've eliminated confusing pricing structures. Pay only for what you need when you need it, with progressive discounts when you buy in bulk. Most importantly, we ensure your news reaches premium publishers who matter to your audience, generating high-quality, shareable links that deliver real results. Created by PR professionals who've been there, done that, BITWIRE solves the problems you actually face. And our dedicated support team is ready to assist, even on Mondays. Visit bitwire.com today and discover how the modern newswire can transform your communication strategy and give you your time and sanity back. BITWIRE, your news amplified.
So obviously our industry is very crowded and it moves really fast. And we've talked a little bit about the founder-led marketing, but what are some of the core elements of strong brand positioning in this industry from a marketing perspective? Like, how can you shape a brand and make it stand out?
It's a great question. And I think it's harder, like you said, a lot of it's been said and done before. I think you have to really tap into people's emotions, and you really have to think about not just the value that you're adding, but why people are passionate about that, and what is that, and how does it make people feel. And it goes back to basics. Like, this isn't anything new. This is basics of marketing, and how are you creating that brand, and how are you enabling and empowering your community to extend that brand for you, especially in early days. Like, how are you empowering, at Algorand, we started with a really small community. It was tiny. It grew from nothing. And we empowered those community members, and there's a handful of them that are still around today that are really like driving a lot of the narrative around Algorand. And that was 6, 7, 8 years ago. And so I think your community is part of your brand. And I think people need to remember that. I also think like the narrative and the storytelling, it's not necessarily done in a daily tweet, right? You have to kind of share and outline that vision. And I think there's more to that story and that narrative. I also think that many people in crypto, we're all moving so fast and breaking stuff and worrying about it later, which is fantastic. But at some point, I do think it still makes sense to sit down and put like some careful thought around a product market messaging doc, right? And what that is, and how you flow, and how you position the space that you're in and the problem that you're solving for. We sometimes see pitches that don't have that information. And I think it's important for people to just remember to frame what they're doing in the context of the challenge and in the context of what people are emotional and driven by.
Those are all great points. How does a brand in crypto or the startups you work with, how are they measuring success in the area of marketing and PR? I know it's so hard to put metrics around it. And you mentioned like it's shifted with Twitter follower count, for example, versus engagement. But what are some of the things that matter to you or like that you look for in terms of measuring success?
I go back to the sentiment and the actual quality and the substance. So it's not necessarily, this project has 150,000 followers on whatever platform or in whatever Discord channel. They reached that bar of 100 or 150,000 followers. That's all well and good, but how did they get them, and how quickly did they get them, and what are they doing? And so, in many cases, I think we're trying to reach these bars for, exchange listing metrics purposes, or having to cross like bottom thresholds, which is fine if that's how the exchanges want to measure stuff. But I think there's a lot more interesting things if you peel back a few layers of the onions to see, are those real followers? Are they actually engaging? How many of them have been alive and existed on Twitter for more than 12 months, right? And so it's not, the bare bones are fine, but it comes down, I think for me, it comes down to what's the overall sentiment? What are the word mapping? What are the top words that pop out when you go in? And there are platforms that can do all this, right? What are the words that pop out when you look across an entire brand's community and what are those big words and what does that mean and what does that translate to for the community and what does that translate to for the brand. And so I think if you look at all those things, there's much more interesting stuff in terms of actual engagement, of substance, like solid engagement. And then there's also the actual sentiment.
Are there any tools that you can share of how you go about that? Like this word mapping is really interesting to me.
Yeah. What's the, what platform did we used to use? It wasn't Sprout Social. It was called something else. But there's a couple like MarTech platforms that will just basically look across your whole brand, and you have to like set it up. You have to spend some time saying, oh, okay, if your brand is cloud, like it takes a little bit of extra effort to figure out how you're getting all that through because it's so generic. But many times in crypto, you've got ways of more easily doing that just with some of the naming conventions. But there's platforms that will pull that stuff together. And I think it's hard. And again, sort of being in the muck with a lot of the early stage stuff, this is something that not everyone has a lot of time for because everyone's running so lean and mean. But I think it's important to just sort of pause and like think about that. Like, what are people actually saying about us? What's the temperature check? You can't throw out community polls and customer service, surveys like you could have 10, 15 years ago. So you got to get a little more creative about how you're getting feedback and how you're taking that temperature check.
Yeah, great advice to focus on the things that actually matter and move the needle as opposed to like the vanity metrics is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, the vanity metrics are just, it seems weird to me. I'm not sure that even drives, I don't know. I mean, you look at some of the meme coins and it's like, well, what's going on there anyway? And some of the vanity stuff. But I think when people are really passionate, you get different sentiment and you get different actual real engagement on whatever you're doing.
So you entered this space from like trains and all sorts of different industries. What advice do you have for people who might be in PR and marketing, but not in crypto yet, in terms of like how they enter or what opportunities there are here or any like myths that we can bust about what crypto marketing is?
Yeah, I think people outside of crypto can be intimidated by what crypto is and what the perception is. And I think everyone should just get over that. I mean, it's an amazing community. It's super warm, super welcoming. There's fabulous people doing wonderful things here. And I think if you're coming from outside of crypto, it's also important to know that, Web3, decentralized tech, digital assets, crypto, whatever we're calling it, is infiltrating so many different industries. And, back to the branding challenge, I think it's also a challenge for founders and brands to walk a careful line of the crypto community versus the crypto native community, and then the regular, more traditional world outside of that. And I think they're converging, but you have to still be able to talk to both or show up for both or dress for both, right? Like I remember back in the day, you'd show up to an academic conference and you'd kind of feel like you had to have a suit jacket on or you shouldn't be there. And then you'd switch the afternoon and you'd be at a crypto conference and they'd be like, why are you wearing heels and a jacket? Like, this is crazy. So you almost like have to throw sneakers on so you can get mocked, right? And I think that's shifting a little, especially you see more and more events, you see more and more, even reporters. I mean, this, Kelly, you see more and more reporters that are dancing between, traditional markets and crypto markets and traditional technology as we know it and like sort of new decentralized tech. And I think that's what's exciting. And I think that's what people should get excited about. I also think it's way more interesting and it's way more easy to enter this space now than for sure it was a number of years ago.
I love that you pointed out how welcoming it is because I feel like it gets a bad reputation for not being as welcoming as it could be. But I think that my experience at least has been that, women in crypto are really supportive of one another in particular, but in general, there is this like, hey, come join us. There's like a lot of fun, amazing stuff happening here. You should come join us. So
if you weren't a computer scientist or an economist or a traditional financial trader, there's some things that are intimidating for sure. And I think that is hard. I mean, I've been there, I've lived that. Like, that's not my world. Even now today, I'll get into conversations that are way above my head. And you just got to ask people to take some time to unpack it and you'll get there. But, there's a lot more resources available, and it's super interesting. And when you really deeply understand the ethos of what decentralized technology can do for a number of different industries, I think that's where it gets really exciting.
Shifting gears a little bit, I want to dig in. Today, I learned that you are a mom of 4 children, which I am so impressed and inspired by. I have 3, and I love that you navigate, a flourishing career and motherhood. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how do you juggle the 2 roles? Do you have any advice for people who are like, maybe intimidated by the idea of having both?
Yeah, great question. You are also juggling a lot with 3. Once you have more than 2, it's all kind of the same. So, go to 4, only the brave. And yeah, listen, I think, what's helpful about this space is that it's global and it's at all hours of the day. So you can kind of manage your calendar and your schedule around that. I also think I'm so motivated by being here, and there's nowhere else I'd rather be. I love my children also, and I enjoy spending time with them, and it's a balancing act for sure. But, being able to understand where the world's going is only more helpful to your kids. So, and I think I'm motivated enough by both to be able to manage both. I also think that as this industry has grown up, there are more and more people in it that have kids. That was not the case 5 years ago. I remember not telling a single soul I was pregnant. And I remember not telling anyone for years that I even had children. And I think that mentality has shifted, and it's okay because the space is a little bit more mature. Tons of room to go. It's generally still a young crowd, and there's many years for this industry to grow. So I'm not trying to say anything negative there, but I just think it's kind of different now than it was a number of years ago.
I fully agree. I mean, we're all growing up, but I had the same experience. I was kind of a little bit like oddly ashamed by the fact that I was pregnant with my first. I didn't really want to expose that and think, but I think that we've come a long way. And now there's all these awesome, like, are you a member of any of these communities that like for crypto moms?
I am not as into the crypto mom communities, but I think that's more a bandwidth and time issue on my side.
That's fair.
I should be. I realize that. I do. I am. A lot of people in my network are aware, and I've had many conversations with folks about childcare, club sports, kids sports. When you do this, I'm happy to share any of those details if anyone needs anything. But no, I'm not as involved in the crypto moms clubs, and I probably should be.
Well, it's just nice for camaraderie generally. I'm not as involved on a day-to-day, but I do like when I go to conferences and things that there's like, if there's groups of women, it's nice to be able to have like those 2 things in common now. And there are more and more like badass crypto moms. So I love that.
Yeah. And I think there's also an element of, I know I've talked to other people about this, but sort of how we educate the up and coming generation. I am really passionate about that. Like the clubs and universities, I brought that up earlier, but it's a huge miss. Like in the US, we're not really teaching financial management or anything about money. You don't get basic economics until much later in college, probably. And I think that's a huge miss. And I think being able to educate kids about what's going on in the world is super important, and how money works and the difference between hard money and soft money. I have a lot of nieces and nephews, and in addition to my children, and it was, I think 2 years ago, Christmas presents, I got everyone a little tiny piece of silver, one of the little tiny gold things. And I wrote them a booklet, and it was catered towards like a 4th grade understanding level. And everyone from like age 4 through 18 got this. And I wrote up 2 or 3 pages on like the difference of hard money versus soft money and Bitcoin as like a teaser. And so I've had to build upon that every year for Christmas gifts. But that's
I want to see this.
Yeah.
I'm like, where do we buy it?
I'll send you one. But like, just, I think it's important for like educating the up and coming generation about what's going on. And my kids like really help me do that, because they like give me a different level of understanding of what's going on in the education system, what people are learning at a younger age, and what they're not learning, and why that matters. So,
do you have any advice for time management tips and tricks, or context switching tips and tricks?
Every minute matters. I used to tell people my sort of, everyone has a superhuman talent, and mine is that I can go for a few days with like very little sleep, which is I think the only reason why I can kind of get through some of the crypto conferences, the crypto traveling. The time management thing is so hard, and the multitasking thing is super hard. I think there's tons of tools that make things much easier to parent and to work. Everything from Calendly's to, the stupid skylight hanging on my wall that we now have. And the time management is hard. Every minute counts. Train rides count. Airplane rides count. All of that matters. And I'm also a fan of, when I'm traveling for work, to just totally fill my schedule so that I'm taking the most advantage of being, if I'm not going to be with my kids and my family, I'm going to be doing whatever I can for our founders and our network and new investments we're looking at.
I relate so much to everything you just said. And what I'm hearing too is that you just love your work and you love your home life. And so it's, you're able to maximize the joy in both of those areas.
It's fun, I think, and we'll see more and more of it. I mean, I was at a couple of my kids play lacrosse across a few different teams, and it was too far away, and I didn't catch him. But there was like another one of the trading platforms, or I forget if it was Wintermute or Galaxy, or someone had a sweatshirt on. I'm like, oh, all the crypto parents.
Love it, bonding at the lacrosse field.
That's right.
All right. Well, wrapping up here, I wanted to kind of get your take, switching back to, your marketing and crypto hat. Like, where do you see this going? Where do you see crypto related, marketing and PR going over the next few years? Are there any trends or shifts that you think that people might want to think about preparing for now? I know we talked about like the sort of transition to founder-led marketing, which I think is such a great point. Is there anything else that you see kind of happening and that we should be keeping an eye on?
I think sort of building a repository of what you're doing and the journey you've been on is also important. I mean, you just sort of, as you're talking about things we should be thinking about in the future, showing where you've come as a project, as a startup, as a community, and taking people along with that, but sort of building up those customer stories or taking advantage of the major milestones and making big moments of those. I think those are really important. Like when you look back at a project's timeline and seeing how far they've come, or the metrics that they've done, or the value that they've been able to add and contribute is really important. And so I think having a stable, long-standing brand that has some legacy will become more and more important. I also think it's really important that you think about how people are using and engaging you that doesn't have anything to do with marketing, because that is also marketing. How easy is it for people to use your product? How automated things are, how simple things are, the UI. Like it's almost with some of these DeFi things, or with some of the on-ramps, or with some of this other stuff, there's other things that come into play besides marketing that people don't realize is part of marketing. Like that's word of mouth. Like, hey, I use this, it was super easy. Hey, I use this, it was, very slick, and the yields were good and the returns were good, and I did cash management over here, or whatever it might be, right? So I think it's just sort of thinking holistically. It's not just the PR, it's not just the community. All of these different marketing elements don't stand alone. It's not paid social, it's not paid placements, it's not showing up to the events. How the entire thing is held together is really important. And I think as crypto matures, crypto should just, like Web3 companies should just keep those things in mind, that they don't stand alone. They're all threaded together, and threading those together as your timeline moves on is really important.
Well, and you just mentioned UI UX. How important is that?
Yep. We still see a lot of things that are very clunky. And I mean, where I'm standing, that's totally fine, because we're doing early stage, and early stage stuff is supposed to be clunky. But everyone's got to sort of be aware that that is a industry branding challenge. If like somebody can't figure out how to go to Coinbase, get something, swap it to a different wallet, take it and do something with it on another platform, and then come back, and they somehow, like, if they can't bridge something or cross one little tiny, puddle there in that process, then it doesn't work, right?
What's the most fulfilling part of your job today?
Most fulfilling part is when we have great founders with great products that get to a point where they want to talk about them. And then they start to talk about them, they hone that message, and then things start to take off for them. And I really love seeing that. We've had a couple of founders this year where they've sort of hit where the rubber meets the road and being able to talk about what they're doing, whether they were trying to be stealth for a little bit because they had just raised a pre-seed and were sort of building out an MVP or testnet. And then, they want to work with me, or they want to start engaging with agencies, or they want to start being on stage more, talking more at conferences, or getting booths, or bring their community and building it out more. I think that's the most fulfilling part for me, when we invest in a product and a vision that makes sense, and then they want to start talking about it, right? That's just naturally the most exciting part for me.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Kelly, for coming on the show. You are such, this has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate all your tips, and I love how much you love your job. And, just thank you. How can people stay in touch with you, see what you're up to, reach out?
Of course. Yeah. I'm at Keli Callaghan, at KeliCallaghan on Twitter, X. And feel free to DM me open there. My DMs are open. Feel free to head over that way.
Amazing. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Proof of PR. This episode was brought to you by BITWIRE.com, the modern newswire reimagined for today's comms professionals. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you listen today. To stay up to date on upcoming guests and news, visit proofofpr.com or follow us on Twitter at Proof of PR. Until next time, keep learning, innovating, and hodling.